This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 206 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I have something a little bit different and special today, not a regular episode at all, but a while back, in fact, in the early days of COVID it actually was, I came across a fabulous podcast called Alpaca My Bags, and apart from the fabulously fun title, it's actually quite a serious podcast where the host Erin chats with all kinds of interesting guests about really thoughtful travel issues. It's the first other podcast I found that comes close to kind of being similar. They're different in a similar way. Oh, I think you'll just have to listen to find out. But anyway, it's a really awesome podcast. And I got in touch with Erin to say, hey, let's kind of do some collaboration where we can put an episode together, which will go out both for the Thoughtful Travel Podcast and for Alpaca My Bags, so that both the audiences, because I reckon they'll be both interested in each of the podcasts, can find out about us and find out about the podcasts. So that's what we did. It was, in fact, the early days of COVID, but we've just got around to getting it out. And that's why you'll hear me say that we were in lockdown at the time. Of course, here in Western Australia right now, we can do pretty much everything except leave Western Australia. So we're locked in but not locked down. So there's all sorts of interesting topics that Erin and I discuss as we learn about each other's travel habits, about the podcasts, and there's a few episodes that get a special mention, and those episodes I'm going to add in the show notes as well. So without further ado, as they say, here is the chat that I recorded with Erin from Alpaca My Bags.
So, Amanda, you reached out to me over Instagram, I believe it was. I actually can't remember anymore.
I don't remember either, but I do remember that coincidentally, actually, one of my lovely listeners who's also named Erin put me onto your podcast. So she is actually an American living in Copenhagen who's been on my podcast. And she said, Amanda, you have to listen to this podcast. It's awesome. And I hadn't found you before that. And then I saw even just the titles of the episodes, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like completely me. I love this stuff. So, yeah. And then I thought, I have to talk to you.
That's awesome. I was so happy to hear that you'd heard about us through someone else. That's so nice to hear when people are telling other people about the podcast. And you live... Where in Australia are you?
Oh, I'm in Perth in Western Australia. So it's famous for being the most isolated city in the world because the next city is like a 3.5-4 hour flight away.
I've been there, and I know that it is actually the furthest city that you can go to from Toronto, which is where we are.
No way.
So I remember being there and thinking, like, this is literally the furthest I could get from Toronto without going into the bush.
Oh, that's lovely. That's just like, yeah. So we are really on the opposite sides of the world and chatting. That's perfect.
Truly. It's so cool. How long have you been doing your podcast? And can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. So I run the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. So the Thoughtful Travel Podcast is always about thinking about travel, it's not a destination-based podcast. It's not about, 25 things to do in Perth. I usually chat with 2 or 3 guests each episode, like separately, and combine it all together around a particular topic. So, and sometimes it's, quite thoughtful, like quite deep, personal development and travel, or sustainability issues. And sometimes it's more fun and frivolous, but still about, kind of the bonus parts of travel. Like I had one recently about stories of people you've sat next to on a plane, and had, 3 hilarious and fascinating stories from different guests who'd sat next to really intriguing people on airplanes. So, yeah, it kind of varies, yeah.
I actually listened to that one, and I was giggling so loudly. My partner was like, "What are you listening to?" And I had to make him listen because it was so funny.
I know, especially the first story, Paul, with the woman who fell asleep on him. That really made me laugh a lot.
Yeah. Definitely recommend that particular episode if you want some lighthearted content. But I really like that approach that you mix up the more heavy and thoughtful content with lighter things. That's something we also try to do because I think it just gets a little too it's almost exhausting to like constantly be thinking critically about it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I love how, I mean, you guys talk about travel through thinking about it through a critical lens, which is like a much better way of saying what I've been trying to say all these years. But it's very succinct and clear. But yeah, I've listened to a bunch of your episodes, and although you have a lot of that serious stuff, which is super important, I was just listening actually this morning to the one for Christmas time with you and Katie, your producer, chatting. And I love that as a different kind of episode as well. It's always nice to get to know, the people behind the podcast as well.
Yeah, we really miss recording in person right now. So up until this point, we would always record together in the room. And I really love that Katie is part of the podcast, but in a less obvious way. Like our listeners are very aware of her because like she does pop in here and there to say things, or you'll hear her giggling in the background. And I really love that element of it. I think it like really humanizes us as a podcast. And so it's been a really strange transition to move into this remote recording situation. And I really
miss you, Erin.
I know I miss you, Katie.
Yeah, it's really nice because it took me, I've been doing it for 4 years. And so now I really know my listeners really well because we have a Facebook group and they're really active. And, I've even got to meet heaps of them. So they are real people. But certainly in the first few months, I felt like I was talking to no one. And if I'd had like a producer in the corner or next to me, that would have made a big difference to feel like I was actually speaking to real people.
Yeah. So how has it been with coronavirus where you are?
Well, it seems like, I don't know, perhaps the advantage of being in the isolated part of the world means it's moving quite slowly. But now we're at home. I've moved all my work online. My son's at home. We don't really go out except to the park, which luckily is straight across the road from us. And I'm not thriving because I'm an extrovert and I really like to have people around me. But we just won't be traveling anywhere. That's the worst part.
I know. How have you been feeling about that? Also, like, tell me about your background with travel and like the role that it's played in your life. What led you to making this podcast? Just your relationship with travel.
Mm-hmm. So travel has always been important to me, even as a child. I was really lucky. So here in Australia, people get something called long service leave. So my dad had been working at the bank for many years, and so he could take 6 months off paid. And in that 6 months, when I was 9, my parents took us to Europe. We bought a motorhome, a camper van, and we travelled around for 6 months. So it was a very budget-based trip, but it was 6 months, which is a really long time when you're 9 years old. Made a really big impression to me, and coming from, somewhere like Australia where, you can't drive to a border, there's nowhere. Suddenly we could drive across borders and the language would change and the culture would change and the food would change. And that was just blew my mind. And I wanted to do more and more of that. So did lots of other trips. But when I was in my mid-20s, I moved abroad for about 6 years. So I decided to go as an English teacher because this is kind of 15, 18 years ago now, that was kind of the way to do it. You couldn't really be a digital nomad back then. But so I lived in Japan for a couple of years and Slovakia and in Germany for a few years and did lots of travel like in between those contracts and all of that. So that was kind of my really intense travel period. And, I'm kind of I don't feel alive unless I'm, getting ready to travel. Really, that's, I don't know, it just lights me up and it, changes everything for me. It's influenced every part of my life. And now I'm based back in Perth and I have a 10-year-old son. He's just turned 10, I have to remember. And we travel as much as we can. So it's just him and me. So he's an awesome travel companion. And I have completely brainwashed him to be obsessed with travel as well. So, so we get out into the world as often as we can, which is not super often when we live in Perth because it's quite far to everywhere. And, I still have to work my kind of quote unquote day job stuff, and he has to go to school sometimes. But certainly travel infiltrates everything that we think about and everything we do. What about you? Where did your travel come from? Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, it's so good to hear that you can brainwash your own children, because that's definitely my plan.
Yes. When you need tips, I've got them all.
I'll be in touch. My partner and I are already like, okay, so mat leave, we'll do that in Italy, right?
Oh, that's perfect. Exactly. Yeah, yep.
We're just thinking
you are
about
on the right track
can...
already.
Yeah.
No, they're definitely brainwashable. I mean, I don't know. I guess they all come out different, but mine, I don't know. I don't know if I hadn't done it, would he be different? I don't know, but it's good for them too. I can see so many aspects of his personality and his values and stuff that have been shaped by our travels. So it's brainwashing for a really good cause.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, children are just sponges for information. And when you travel, you're taking in all new information and new culture. And it's more information overload than you ever get at home. So I imagine that as a child, it's very stimulating to travel.
Absolutely. I mean, what really annoys me now is because I've always really prided myself on my geography knowledge. And now, because of his, he's got a 10-year-old brain instead of a 44-year-old brain, he can quiz me. We've got this map in our hallway with all the flags and the capital cities and currencies and everything. And he'll quiz me, and he knows more than I do now. He'll know, a really obscure, Central African nation's capital and currency that I don't know, and it really bugs me. So then I spend hours staring at it trying to memorize them all, but he's just better at it.
That's incredible. Well, that also means you're doing a great parenting job, because he's a sharp one. So
I hope so, yeah. Still annoying though.
Yeah, so I guess for me, interestingly, my parents never traveled much with us as children, but they had traveled together before they had us. So my parents got married later in life, and they had us towards the end of their 30s. So they had done a lot of living by the time they had us, and that included a round the world trip. And growing up, my parents would tell me these stories all the time about their trips. And I have distinct memories of looking through photo books that my mom was a photographer when she was young, especially. And so when they traveled, she always took these incredible photographs, and she just has books and books of them. So I remember sitting on the floor and looking through these and asking questions. And I think, although I didn't travel with my family a lot because, it was expensive, there were 3 kids, it just wasn't in the budget to take us overseas, they still were able to stimulate our interest in it by telling us these stories that really fascinated us. And then with the photos to back them up, it inspired a lot of curiosity in me. And then when I was a teenager, they really encouraged me to make my own money to go out and work. And I wanted to do that. And they said, okay, you can save that money to do with whatever you want. And I told them I wanted to travel. And I think I was 17 or 18. And interestingly, I have friends who their parents would have never said that. But my parents were like, oh yeah, save your money and go to Europe. And it just was no issue for them. They really encouraged me to just save some money and fly to Europe by myself and travel around, which is what I ended up doing. And I was hooked from that moment onwards. And like you say, it's become something that just gives me such happiness in life. And I feel the most alive, like you, when I'm traveling. And I feel like it's an addiction. I'm always thinking about when I can next explore somewhere new.
It is an addiction, I agree.
Yeah. I met my partner in a hostel, and from that moment forth, we were together and we just feed each other's obsession. And so once you're with someone who's equally obsessed, you have your son, for me, it's my partner, we just feed each other. So it's our conversations are constantly around, where are we going to go next?
I think there are way worse addictions we could have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like you were saying, like you had sort of a peak moment of travel. And I think I also had that in the last like few years. I managed to slip away from work and take time off school to do some really long trips and to live abroad. And now because I work full time, it's more like I get a lot of time off, but it's not nearly what I would ideally have. Yeah. And so now I found that this podcast and my blog are kind of my outlet where I share my experiences and my thoughts and
get to talk to other people who are, have done different kinds of travels. And yeah, I kind of do a lot of vicarious traveling through my guests, and it really helps because it's not quite the same as doing it yourself. But when you get to have a good chat with someone about a trip you've never been able to take, then that really does help, feed that travel addiction.
I'm wondering what some of you've been doing it for 4 years, so you must have so much to say on this, but I'm sure you've experienced, as I have, that hosting a podcast like this I'm by no means an authority, and I always try to emphasize that. I'm just enabling other people to share their knowledge and their perspectives. And so I find I'm constantly learning as I host this podcast, and I'm sure you are as well.
Exactly the same, for sure.
I'm curious what your biggest takeaways or what the most impactful things you've learned have been.
Oh gosh, so many. I think, like, I always try to adopt this philosophy of like know more and do better, because I remember, only a handful of years ago where I didn't realize, for example, that, that riding an elephant was definitely a no-no. To me now, that's clearly a, horrible thing to do. Elephants shouldn't be, broken in and all of this, that seems to me very clear now. But I remember very clearly when someone first mentioned that to me, and it was before my podcast, but it was through my travel blog a few years ago. So I've done things in the past that I wouldn't do now. And so I always have this like know more, do better kind of thinking. And I don't expect my my listeners to have thought about everything that my guests will then tell them about either. I think every guest teaches me, one or two little things that I then, kind of fit into my kind of hierarchy of how to be a thoughtful traveller, I suppose. So, certainly stories from guests who've done or guests who've been involved with volunteer organisations that are either very good or very bad. I'm really aware of, bad volunteerism projects and, orphanage tourism kind of things. And I've learned a lot about those from my guests. And hearing from someone who's like seen this stuff, firsthand is so much more powerful than kind of just reading an article about it, that doesn't, I don't know, it's just not quite the same as hearing from someone who's really been there, done that. So, I don't know, there's so many things that I've learned, little sustainability tips or even just like personal stuff, the way that people have, grown and changed. I had a guest recently who talked to me about how she has a different personality when she's traveling compared to when she's at home. And I kind of like, it's really something that stuck with me, and I've been trying to think, oh yeah, in some ways I do too. Isn't that interesting? And can I bring more of my travel personality, which I think is like my superior personality? Can I be more like that in my normal life? And I mean, there's just endless things. My guests are incredible, like with the kinds of things that they teach me about, and hopefully that then we can together pass on to my listeners, I suppose. But I'm curious to know, what kind of things have you learnt from your guests as well?
Well, I'll just start by saying that the different personality thing, that is hilarious. And I completely agree. I am the same way as well. My partner and I joke about how, like, when we go traveling, we become absurdly silly to the point that, like, we could not be the way we are when we travel at home because we wouldn't be accepted into society.
That's true. You can get away with a lot more when you're on the road, hey?
Especially when, like, the people around you can't understand you. Like, I remember traveling in India and we had, like, almost a different language developed because it really didn't matter. We were so insular. Like, we never encountered other travelers. And so we just sort of, like, digressed into this random language that we had developed. It's so funny that other people experience this as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely been impacted by the interviews that I've held on this podcast and the people that I've talked to and the perspectives that have been brought to my attention. And I have to say, like, now when I do travel, I find that I travel more aware of certain issues. Like, for example, like you mentioned, the animal tourism and the treatment of wildlife. I definitely used to have a more nonchalant approach to it, whereas now I've learned what to look for and what the red flags are. And it's more top of mind than it used to be when I traveled. And that's really thanks to reaching out to people who have experience and can share what they've seen and what they've learned. Another really impactful one was an episode we did with the campaign No White Saviors. You may have seen them. They're all over Instagram. They're fantastic.
They are great. Yeah, I love their work. It's very, very impactful to me, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking with them was, I'll admit, I was like so overwhelmed to speak with them because I know that like I am part of the problem to a degree. And so that conversation, the biggest thing I learned from them, and I always think about this now, they said to me repeatedly, we need to ask people to travel for what a country has, not what it doesn't have. It's such a succinct way of saying, like, travel isn't about seeing where a country doesn't excel. It's not about taking pictures of dirt roads or impoverished communities. It's about celebrating what those countries do have.
That's very, very true.
Another one that really struck me was more recent. We interviewed an environmental activist about the impact of flying. And admittedly, this was also something I'd argue I've been willfully ignorant about because I didn't want to accept.
Sometimes it's better not to know, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. But that said, like, coming away from that conversation, it did really equip me to think about, okay, I cannot cut out certain flights because otherwise that would mean I can't travel. But what I can cut out are domestic flights. And it helped me to realize, okay, like taking a flight from Toronto to Ottawa it's not necessary, and I should really put more effort into stopping that. And so I have. And so, yeah, it's really like incredible the way that the guests have shaped my view of travel and the way that I travel. And I think like collectively, they've helped me become a more intentional and responsible traveler. And I hope that the listeners have the same experience.
I'm sure they do. I've always, often heard stories back from my listeners, and because it's been going for quite a few years, it's had enough time that it has changed, their habits and their choices. And I like to think that we're really helping. So, I'm not perfect. And when you live in Perth, it's nearly impossible to travel without flying because nowhere really is driving or train distance unless it's just nearly impossible. But I do take that on board, quite heavily, and at least, cut down the number of trips and do, I'm really into the slow travel approach where I go to one destination for a longer time, and, let go of the, that desire to check off a bunch of things on a list and try and experience something in a longer, more, kind of local feeling way instead, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, my guests have certainly changed a lot about the way I travel, and definitely all for the better. Yeah.
What are the things I'll give you the reason I'm asking this question. I actually chatted last night with a friend of mine who had just been to Mexico City, and I have been there as well. And we were talking about what our favorite parts of the city were. And my friend and I had really different experiences because although we were both there for almost a week, the things that we focused on were really different. So for example, she was really into the museums of Mexico City, whereas Lucas and I we're more interested in like walking around all the different markets. And it's got me thinking a lot about the things that stick with me after travel and the memories that remain the most vivid and the experiences that I appreciate the most down the road. And I think it's very different. It's a very, very subjective, and personal preference. So yeah, for me, it's definitely markets and cafes. And like I said, slow travel for me is just about that, about like spending a long time just sitting around and watching the world go by. And I think that that's something people really take for granted sometimes. What about you? What tends to stick with you?
Yeah, similar. I mean, it's a little bit different because I'm always traveling nearly always traveling with my son. And so, I mean, in fact, he kind of taught me this, I have to admit. So pre him, I would land in a new place and I'd want to see everything. And I would, race around and, tick off all the sites. But I soon, pretty early on learnt that with a kid, that was not going to work out at all. And so I'm grateful for him for having taught me this, along with, things I've learnt from my guests. So I I just approach it as we're going to go and stay somewhere and just see what's around. Like I rarely plan much. For example, last year we went to Copenhagen and Denmark and we had about 8-9 days in Copenhagen first up. And we just had an Airbnb apartment in a, nice local area, but fairly close to the city centre. And we rented bicycles. We didn't use even any public transport. One time we went on a train to an art gallery in the north, but other than that, we were on our bikes the whole week. And, we went and saw a few, kind of sightseeing kind of things, but we didn't necessarily go and see everything. We certainly didn't see everything that would be on the, 10 things to see in Copenhagen list. And we explored local parks. We had his soccer ball, so we went and kicked that in various different parts of Copenhagen and, all sorts of just little things like that. When we look back on it, we remember being in the apartment building and seeing how, the local people lived. Like there was a childcare centre that was housed within our apartment building. So we'd see all the little kids come out at certain break times and see what happened there. And we'd see all the dads come and pick them up at the end of the day because Copenhagen is so forward that like there's maternity leave and paternity leave and it's really 50-50. So there'd be all these dads who were in charge of the kids and things like this and, which was astounding to me and wonderful. And, we would go to different bakeries because we'd heard that, Danish pastries are pretty good and they were right. And so we'd try lots of those things. And so those are the kind of things that we look back on and remember the most. And yeah, we didn't go to many museums. We went to like one really awesome art gallery that, a friend of mine had recommended and she was spot on. It was brilliant. But we didn't go to all of the, tick the box kind of places. And I don't mind at all that we didn't do that because I just love that feeling. Like I felt, okay, this is how, if I was going to live in Copenhagen, this is how it would feel. And I really loved being able to experience that.
Yeah, it is about getting into the habit of feeling like you actually know what like life is like in that location as much as you can as a tourist.
Of course, yeah. But certainly, yeah, there's sort of, there's things you can do to make, give yourself that feeling more. And of course, other people want to see all the museums and if those particular museums are your thing, that's totally fine. Or go and see, all the, I don't know, seeing the Little Mermaid is the thing in Copenhagen, but really that's, we saw it from a boat trip we did from behind and heard all the funny stories from the Danish guy we were with who grew up living near it and, had to redirect tourists who couldn't find it because they were expecting it to be like Statue of Liberty size instead of like doll size and stuff like that. So that was our experience of that. And, that was for me a better experience than lining up with the crowds of tourists. And yeah, so, yeah, I mean, everyone to their own, but like, I think you're right. You've got to sort of figure out what you really get out of, like you said, exactly right. What do you remember later? What's the stuff that, really sticks with you? And then do more of that.
You've just brought to mind the way you described like living in the apartment and just looking out the window and watching other people really has me reminiscing about our time in India specifically because that was what a lot of our day-to-day life became because there's actually, and if you spend a long time there, which we did, you kind of run out of touristy things to do. So little things like noticing that they sell chips there in these like, they're like all attached to each other. So they'll hang. So you'll see these like long hanging lines of chips. I don't know how to describe it. They're all attached to each other, like at the bottoms.
Right. And you could like tear them off or...
Yeah, you can tear them off. So the joke would become like, can we find the longest string of chips to buy? Like, how many bags could we get in one strip?
I love that. Oh, my son would be all over that. He would be looking everywhere.
Yeah. And things like that are the things that I like really reminisce about and remember afterwards. And just like the people staring at us because we're walking around with like 20 bags of chips attached to each other.
Oh, I could travel with you. You're my kind of traveler.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I'm curious how you go about deciding on destinations, especially with your son. Does he play a big part in choosing where you guys will go?
I definitely get him involved because there's nothing worse than trying to drag a child to somewhere that they think they don't want to go. So I definitely make sure he is involved for sure. And it's often kind of random though. Like, for example, when we went to Copenhagen, we actually we had to go to Thailand for a family wedding, for my son's cousin's wedding. And I had it in mind, well, when we're going to Thailand, we'll look for an airfare that goes, somewhere else as well, or we'll go, but I was kind of thinking somewhere else in Southeast Asia. But, then I'm on all these, email lists for, great airfares. And there was this awesome deal that would take us to Thailand. We could stop for the wedding and then go on to either Copenhagen or Stockholm, I think it was. No, Oslo. Copenhagen or Oslo were our choices. And it was a super deal and it was just the right time. And so I said to him, hey, look at this. This is a great deal. And, where should we go? And he's obsessed with Lego because he's a boy who, loves to build things. And so, of course, he knew that, Lego is from Denmark and we could go to the Danish Legoland and the Lego house and all of this stuff if we went to Denmark. And so he said, well, definitely Copenhagen. I was like, okay, let's go. So, it was really kind of a random thing. But then I got him involved to choose. So sometimes it's a lot of random stuff. Sometimes it's trips that are through the podcast. And so we're invited on various trips and we'll go anywhere we're invited pretty much. So that's good. Or like I took him to Japan a couple of years ago because like I lived there, for 2 years, but before I had him. And so I'm quite obsessed with Japan and have told him lots of stuff about it over the years. So he was very ready to go there and he's ready to go back as well. He's like, when are we going to Japan again? So, all kinds of random reasons that we travel, really. And I try not to have like a bucket list or anything because I just think there's no way we can go everywhere we want to. Life is not long enough. So let's just see what happens and, we'll pick what happens next. So what about you?
Yeah, we have a very similar approach where usually we have a couple places in mind and then we'll see what kind of flight deals we can find. But yeah, we try not to limit ourselves. For example, like I think it was last year, we had been intending to go back to India. And then one day we got a flight deal in our email that was like, it was something absurd, like $350 to fly to Jordan and back from Canada, which is really far. Yeah. And we thought, okay, well, we can't not do that. So we just booked that instead. And that was our trip. And we were relatively unprepared for it, but it ended up being an incredible experience. And so, yeah, a lot of it has to do with just what deals we find. And we'll talk sometimes about like what kind of trip we want to have, if we want to go somewhere warm, if we want to do hiking, if we want to go to the beach, things like that will factor in. But really, like, there's never any limitations when we travel.
I mean, there's nowhere that you don't want to go, surely. That's how I feel.
No. Yeah.
I'd go anywhere. So yeah, there's something good to be found anywhere. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But more recently, we've been trying to think about traveling more within Canada, which is different for us because we've always traveled internationally and been pretty obsessed with that. And the thing is, travel in Canada is so expensive. And so a lot of the time it's like, oh, well, we could fly to BC, but we could also fly to Asia for less money. And so then that always
factors in. It's the same from same in Australia, exactly. So yeah, it's much cheaper for us to have a trip. I mean, the flight is often cheaper, plus being there is significantly cheaper to be in Asia. I mean, from Perth, it's only 3 hours to Indonesia. So, we can easily get into Asia, and then the cost of living there obviously significantly cheaper than travelling in Australia. Yeah.
Have you ever been to Canada?
I have. I've only been to the West Coast, only to Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and it's probably 15, 16 years ago. I went while I lived in Japan, and I loved it. I always reckon that, you know, Canada and Australia have so many similarities. It's just that it's colder there. But like Canadian people are similar to Australian people, and you're kind of like, you know, a massive land area with a small population, and I don't know, really like-minded. And I would love to get back and see way more of Canada because I love, you know, amazing landscapes, and clearly I have seen plenty of pictures to prove to me that there's a lot of that in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my regrets is not going to Darwin when I was in Australia. I really want to go up to the northern part of Australia. For some reason, it just seems so mysterious to me.
I have to confess, I haven't been to Darwin either, and I feel the same about it, but I have not had the chance to get there yet. So I've been to the Northern Territory and to Uluru in the south of the Northern Territory, but I've never been up to Darwin, and it does seem mysterious. It seems like a place where it's almost lawless. It's not in a good way. Like, it's just, you know, kind of this chilled out place where people are a little bit nuts, and I want to go. So one day.
I know. Aussies, when I was in Australia, the thing I learned is that Aussies will always poke fun at you, and they love to
Yes.
they love to playfully lie to you. And so I got a lot of stories about drop bears and snakes and other things that were out there to try to eat or harm me. But one of these such stories, and you can tell me if it's true or not, because it could be totally untrue. Someone told me that if I went up to Darwin, not to go near the ocean, because the second you step in the ocean, a crocodile will attack you.
Honestly, I can't confirm or deny, but it does seem a little bit dramatic.
Yeah.
The second you step in it, it does seem, you know, I don't know. I don't want to endanger you by saying, no, that's rubbish, but I honestly don't know. I don't understand the whole crocodile thing in the north because it freaks me out. And so I just try and bury my head in the sand and not learn about it, I think. Because down here we have just beautiful beaches, so you can swim here in Perth anytime. It's cold, the water always, but it's beautiful, and it's, you know, an occasional shark, but very rare, and, you know, usually it's fine. So we just can hop in the ocean any old time. The crocodile thing is a bit scary. Blah.
I went out to Rottnest Island when I was there in Perth, and that's actually one of the most beautiful places I went in Australia. It was incredible.
It's beautiful there. Did you get the chance to stay overnight or just have a day trip out there?
I didn't. I didn't even know you could stay overnight. I just did the day trip.
Yes. So I think we kind of keep it a bit of a secret, but that is the ultimate thing to do, because during the day trip time, there's a lot more tourists there. But about 4 or 4:30, all the ferries have gone, and then it's just the people who are staying. And it's just an idyllic, amazing, beautiful place. So, you know, there's nearly no cars, only, you know, a few cars for the service people. Oh, it's just, one of my very favourite places in the world. Yeah, it's beautiful. We're very lucky. Yeah.
I can tell you a funny story about when I went to Australia. I went because I had friends here in Toronto who were Australian, and they had come here to work. And I would always make fun of them when they were living here because they thought that squirrels were really cute. Do you know what squirrels are?
Yes, I do, and I think they're really adorable.
Okay, so maybe this is a universal thing. No, so if you're Canadian, squirrels are very annoying. They dig up your lawn, they dig up your garden, like they always eat the tomatoes that I grow. They're annoying, they're pesty.
But they're so cute.
I can kind of understand why they're cute. They have little bushy tails. And so when I went to Australia, I stayed with these friends in Melbourne. And one evening I look out the window and there's this creature on the windowsill, and it was a possum. And I flipped out because I was like, that is the cutest thing I've ever seen. And I became obsessed with the possums. And in the evenings, we'd like go out to the park and I'd walk around looking for the possums just to like get a picture or spot some possums. And it was funny because they were like, you're having the flip reaction. We hate the possums, but you think they're the cutest things in the world.
Exactly. Oh, no. Yes, it's all a matter of perspective when we travel, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the only thing that everyone does agree is cute is the quokkas on Rottnest Island. They're not a pest, and we do think they're adorable. So, but having said that, if we go back to wildlife tourism and stuff, I'm really anti-quokka selfies, and that's the only reason that Rottnest has become famous in recent years is quokka selfies, and it really makes me mad because people they get too close to them and they touch them and they feed them, and that's not okay. So that's just my message for the day: don't take a quokka selfie.
Yeah, that's a really good message, because I'll admit when I was there, I did take a quokka selfie, and that was
Everybody
before.
does.
And it's funny because it goes kind of in stages, because at that time I did feel very strongly that no, you shouldn't interact with elephants. I had some semblance of principles when it came to animal tourism, but when it came to Rottnest Island, it just seemed so harmless. And then in retrospect, I realized that the reason all of these quokkas are so sociable is because people just constantly interact with them. And so these animals are no longer really wild, which is a shame, because isn't that one of the only places that quokkas exist anymore?
There's a small colony of them down in the southwest of Western Australia, of mainland. But otherwise, basically Rottnest is it. So, so they're getting fed all the wrong foods and stuff, and they're, much too tame and reliant on humans and that kind of stuff. So, but about the same, I had exactly the same trajectory. I was totally against, riding an elephant long before I realised that a quokka selfie was harmful. So, this whole no more, do better thing. You can't do better until you learn about it, and that's, just how it is. We can't learn everything all at once by osmosis, so.
Yeah, I love it. I might adopt that saying because it really rings true, I think, especially in the context of travel.
Yeah, because we're always it's just a constant state of learning more things, because there's no handbook that says this is how to be, the most responsible, thoughtful, conscientious traveller ever. These are the rules, and, we don't know that. There's so many things that we're just still learning about. So I didn't make up no more, do better, but I don't know where I heard it first, I must admit.
So what are some topics that you're hoping to touch on in the future with your podcast?
Oh, well, that's a really good question, because, at the moment when people aren't traveling so much, I've been trying to kind of rearrange my topics and make sure that they're, sort of appropriate. But pre-coronavirus, we, of course, in Australia had the bushfires, and that was already a big, a big topic here for travel, and the kind of climate change aspect of that. So I've got an episode coming up soon, which is kind of why is travel still important, even if it's damaging our, the planet? How can we justify traveling? That kind of stuff. I think we can definitely justify traveling, because there's lots of important things about it. I've got some guests I've already spoken to about women's issues around the world, because I think that that's important and I haven't really talked about that much to date. So that's important. I've got some more content coming up on travelling with disabilities, because I think that that's a really underrepresented kind of area in travel. I've got a friend who runs a website called Have Wheelchair Will Travel, and I know from her that 1 in 5 people who are travelling have a disability of some kind or accessibility issues and stuff. So 1 in 5, that's huge. So I think that that's important. All kinds of stuff. Some more things on travelling with anxiety. That's a topic that just keeps coming up. Cultural differences, because cultural differences can be both enlightening but also quite entertaining sometimes when you come across them. And that's probably the next kind of few months that I have in my head. What other topics have you got coming up? Because I love your topics, because they're very meaty, and I love that.
Oh, thank you. Well, similarly, things have shifted because of coronavirus. So we are trying to speak delicately about coronavirus here and there. We decided that we didn't want all of our content to be about that, because I personally am very tired of opening up my app and it just all the podcasts being about coronavirus.
Yes, same. Yes.
We have felt like it's important to talk to people in the industry and just regular travelers about how they're feeling about the fact that travel is really on hold for the unforeseeable future. So we've done a few interviews to take sort of a sampling of how everyone is feeling. And then following that, we're sticking with the original program. So I'm working on an episode about cultural appropriation, which, it's a tough topic to dig into because, and the thing is, there's no real consensus on it. A lot of the time, it seems from what I've learned so far, a lot of it has to do with navigating consent and speaking actively with communities to see whether they view or whether they can support you appropriating a look or a cultural practice. And it can depend on whether you're there in the country or whether you're back home. It also depends on power differences or power imbalance between minority groups and white people. And so there's just so many factors to it. I think it'll be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, that's such a good topic. It's so hard to navigate, isn't it? Actually, I'm really disappointed. I was supposed to be attending an Indigenous tourism conference here in Perth sometime this month, but it's been cancelled because of coronavirus. So, because I was really, wanting to get more of those perspectives, because it's really hard. You don't want to. It's a really hard balance. You don't want to be, inappropriately, culturally appropriating things from but it depends who you talk to as to is this okay or is this not okay. So I can't wait to hear what you come up with there.
Yeah. I was inspired because I've seen in forums this question asked so many times. A traveler will post and say, okay, if I'm going to India, is it okay if I get henna done on my hands? And the responses will always be so varied. And that's what got me interested in this topic. Aside from that, we just recorded a great episode with a woman named Martinique Lewis, who is an influencer who works on representation in media, in travel media, specifically highlighting the Black travel movement. And it was such an enlightening conversation. I'm so excited to share it with everyone.
That's a great topic too. Oh, awesome. See, I love listening to your podcast. Maybe I'll just stop making mine and just listen to yours.
No, don't. We need each other. Honestly, I think the community amongst travel podcasters is one of the things that I've come to really appreciate. It's amazing to see what other people are doing. And I think the more of us that there are, the more voices get heard. And that is a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I just love having someone like you on the podcast scene that is, really, like-minded and really trying to dig deeper and figure out, this whole, how can we travel in the best possible way for ourselves and, for the world. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of collaborative chat with Erin from Alpaca My Bags. It was really fun to get to know her better, and I really highly recommend her podcast because if you like the Thoughtful Travel podcast, there's a really good chance you'll like Alpaca My Bags, and vice versa even. So in the show notes, I'll leave links to a couple of those episodes that we mentioned. For example, from the Thoughtful Travel podcast, episode 178, about the interesting plane passengers, sitting next to you. That was a fun one. And I mentioned Alpaca My Bags holiday special chat and their No White Saviours episode. That's one that Erin specifically mentioned that I found really fascinating. So all of those will have links in the show notes, and you can find the show notes for this episode at notaballerina.com/206. Don't forget, come and join the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers as well. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook or find the link in the show notes where we'll have a lot more great chats to come about travelling thoughtfully. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.